Well, good afternoon and buenos tardes. Welcome to the second session of SISAP Cybersecurity Conference 2022, how financial exposure to cyber risk is managed through the power of data analysis. Today's session will be conducted in English with a Spanish translation provided in the chat window below. Risk is a concept that has been part of the business acumen since the first goods were exchanged for currency. It is only the last decade that technology has shifted from a utility to a business driver. And even more recently, cybersecurity has started to enter the business driver. It is not until the last 4 to 5 years that cyber risk has been spoken in financial terms. It's now entered the realm of business risk. Even as cyber risk has entered the business world, executives and boards are still playing catch up on what cyber risk means to them in business terms. Today, we are joined by 3 panelists that will use their unique perspectives to help us understand that only through analytics can investments in risk reduction be quantified. Joining us today are 3 panelists, the first of which is Bob Vesio, Chief Analytics Officer and inventor of X Analytics. As the inventor of X Analytics, respected expert in the emerging field of risk economics, Bob has created the first patented model to predict cyber risk exposure through the combination of math, science, and a little bit of art. Building off the philosophy that cyber risk can be understood and measured, Bob continues to use X Analytics as the cyber threat landscape evolves. Next, we have Alejandro Gonzalez, Vice President, Information Security and Cybersecurity for Global Bank. Alejandro joins us and has over 25 years working in the financial services industry with leading in IT and information security. He has degrees from the University of Science and Technology in Costa Rica, as well as his MBA from Florida State University. And last, Christian Name, Sales Director, SISAP Colombia. Christian holds his bachelor's degree from the UC San Diego and multiple certifications, including his CISSP, ISO 27001 and 27005 integrators, and his certified ethical hacker certification. Currently the sales director for SISAP Colombia, Christian has held roles as CISO and Director of Professional Services for SISAP. His education and experience has assisted in the delivery of both technical and programmatic solutions for all of his customers. Welcome. I'm going to start my first question off today for Bob. Bob, the risk discussion over the last few years has changed to include cyber risk as a key component of business risk. What do you feel was the driving change of this viewpoint for cyber risk in the business risk discussion?
Yeah, it's a good question, Derek. I feel that you and I have been in the industry for a long time now. In the beginning, in the early days, there was a lot of discussion about vulnerabilities and other technical metrics. And it was expected that those technical metrics would mean something to the executive leadership team and the corporate directors. But what we found as the years have gone on is they really don't understand what any of that really means. Does that mean that their business is running smoothly? Do they have margin at risk? Do they have revenue at risk? They don't know. And so in place of not knowing, there's been a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear that's been wrapped around those particular metrics. As we are where we are today, it's really changed to get an economic or financial understanding of what those metrics mean. And as the corporate directors and the executive leadership teams see that, then they can start to realize, is cyber risk a problem that we need to worry about? Is it something that we've already done a pretty good job with and we can just maintain what we currently have? Or do we need to seek out some ways to transfer some of that risk? Maybe we need to go out and purchase cyber insurance, or maybe we need to offset that risk with our third-party vendors and have them take on that risk through contractual relationships. So it's really matured ultimately over the last 20 or so years. We've really seen this maturity, and I expect that we're going to see that maturity change quite a bit over the next 2-3 years, especially for publicly traded companies here in the United States, due to new guidelines that are being pushed out by the SEC. So I'll pause there, Derek, to see if that helped answer the question.
Absolutely. So you mentioned metrics, and you mentioned things to be measured in those with metrics. What are some of the significant components that need to be measured to reduce that financial exposure?
But I think what we've been measuring isn't wrong, right? We still need to see how vulnerabilities are being treated in organizations. We still need to have an understanding of the threat landscape and where we see both emerging and contracting conditions. And of course, lots of other operational metrics. But I think the real trick there, Derek, is to get those converted into expected loss, where they can see what is my expected loss on an annual basis related to data breach or business interruption or ransomware or theft of intellectual property. There's lots of different subcategories related to those things that I just mentioned. As that is being understood, then they can start to take their current control condition and look at it in the potential of what if implementations. If I were to move any one of the controls that I have either partially implemented or somewhat implemented, if I move those to a better state, what would that make my expected loss look like? And as you go through a series of those what if simulations, all of a sudden you start to see that certain controls do resonate and stand out at the top of the list. They're the things that would best improve expected loss. And that prioritization allows organizations to use their budget. And let's face it, it's a finite budget, and to prioritize an efficient way. And I think ultimately that's what the executive leadership team is asking for.
That's great information. So you mentioned that presenting it to the executives and boards in a meaningful way that they understand, is that transforming their perception of cyber risk?
It is. One trick that we do, Derek, is we actually show it in relation to revenue. We call it a loss ratio, but we take that expected loss, that annual expected loss, and we put it over annual revenue for that organization. And when they see that their cyber problem is, let's say 3 or 5% of revenue, then clearly they feel like they need to address it, right? And that makes sense to them because they can say, wow, we do have a problem. Losing 3 or 5% of revenue due to cyber problems on an annual basis is something that we don't want to report out to our shareholders, or it's something that we don't want to impact how we pay out bonuses across the company, or whatever else it is that motivates them. But on the other hand, if they see that that expected loss ratio is less than 1%, say like 0.25%, then it also gives them comfort where they can say, you know what we have is good enough and we can accept this risk. Sure, we might put some safety nets in place, but it's okay. It's good. And we can move on and focus on other parts of our business. I think ultimately, Derek, cyber is not the main reason that companies exist, right? They exist to have with a mission statement with a very particular purpose. If you're Starbucks, you're selling coffee. If you're Amazon Web Services, you're running cloud services to support all of your customers. Security, cyber risk is just an element of that. And the better that they can understand what that means in terms of the bigger picture, then the better that they can make real decisions in conjunction with other enterprise risks that exist for them.
So that begs another question in my mind, and this will be my last quick hit for you. We've talked boards, we've talked executives. Has the conversation been transferred to shareholders as well? Are shareholders asking similar questions? And how can analytics, if so, how can analytics help executives and boards address that shareholder need?
Yeah, I think this goes back to really Equifax, right? Equifax is still one of the most significant data breaches in terms of financial loss. All in, they're at about $1.5 billion in total loss. What's interesting is that Equifax did take the lead on reporting this information in their quarterly reports out to the shareholders. Obviously, it's in reports like 8K and 10K reports as well. Since Equifax, which has now been several years, we are seeing a growing use of the 8Ks and 10Ks to report out material damages due to cyber out to the shareholders. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier on this call, The current SEC chairman is looking to push out additional guidelines related to reporting out to shareholders. There is an expectation, especially from the activist shareholders, that they do want to understand what the cyber risk condition looks like in organizations. And if there is a material event, they expect to know about it, because it will impact, obviously, things like dividends that are being paid out on those shares that they own.
Right. Well, fantastic. Well, we're going to turn our attention to Alejandro. Alejandro, with your role at Global Bank in direct reporting line, we just heard Bob state some obvious requirements that boards and executives have. Can you give us some real-world examples from how you have implemented data-driven risk analytics, and how you were able to change the conversation with your executive and board members?
Yes, we have recently changed it as part of of the maturity of our security program. We started to do cyber risk quantification like about 6 months ago. Before that, we did KPIs and other metrics to the board and to the executive committee. Like for example, you presented like antivirus coverage, like how many DDoS attacks we have received in the network, and that kind of stuff. And most of the audience, that was not relevant to them. They were just like, okay, are we good? They asked like, are we good in that amount of attacks? Are we good in that amount of coverage? And I obviously said either yes or no, depending on how was the metric. But it didn't have any meaning or significance to them. I mean, they only trust my word as the CISO of the organization. But besides that, they didn't have the measure of the feeling of how the organization was what was the risk of the organization with that kind of metric. So like 6 months ago, we started doing the cyber risk quantification using dollar amounts, and the participation of the audience was impressive for me, because most of the times that I have presented before the board and executive committee, I just felt like I was just talking to myself, and nobody in the audience like give me any feedback. But when I started presenting the numbers based on dollar amounts, they say, "Oh, that's how much are we going to lose?" I don't remember the exact amount, but I think it was around the $17 million, the annual expected loss. And for some of them was like this is too much, and for some of them was like this is so little, like this is good. So I mean, but at least we have a ground to start talking in their language that is money, especially in a financial institution that obviously the money is the one of the main drivers of the organization. So it gave me like a tool to have a better communication with the board and the executive committee. And when you have quantified the risk, it is also easier to get the approvals for the tools or the people or the processes you need to change, or whatever resources you need, because now they have a measure they understand. Because you say, okay, if you let me buy this tool, or if you let me do this investment of this amount of dollars, then we can decrease the expected loss in, like, I don't know, 2 million, for example. So now they say, okay, we can see like the correlation between the investment and the risk. So that's basically the experience I have. Like I say, I only have 6 months doing this, so I'm still new in, not like Bob that has so many years working on that. But that's my experience so far.
Well, it sounds like that even in the 6 months that you've had the ability to change how you present your budgetary needs in more of a data-driven way,
Yeah.
right? And you're
Yes,
saying you can
yes.
quantify it. Has it made it easier to gain budgetary approval for those things with those numbers or with that data backing it up?
Yes, it makes the budgetary requirements easier, because now you say, I mean, I need 2, and I'm gonna decrease the risk in 4, for example. So
So
it's easier
yeah,
because you can reflect it directly on the risk
one
in a
other
measure they
question.
can they understand.
Yeah, one other question in line with that. Did you find that based upon utilizing the quantification of risk that it changed the way you were looking at or what you were going to spend money on in terms of your budget?
In some case, I mean, in some cases, um, I mean, yes, it helped me. In some cases, it helped me like corroborate what was the investment we were gonna do, or the changes in tools, or the addition in tools that we were gonna do. In some cases, we make a shift in our roadmap. Uh, so I mean, both things. It helped me confirm where some of the things I already have in the budget, and in a couple cases I changed what we were gonna do for the priorities. I mean, we changed the
Yeah.
priorities to do some other things that were gonna help decrease the risk more.
Okay. So with this being fairly fresh in the last 6 months, have you faced any significant challenges when moving to more of this data-driven approach to cyber risk reduction?
I think one of the challenge, but I think I consider it a good challenge, is that the people in my team that is helping me with this cyber risk quantification, and myself, got more involved on the with some business areas, because I mean, normally we don't get too much engagement with the business areas and the finance areas, but for this exercise we have to get some data from the business, the volumes, the revenues, the income, and all the information that we need to make the model that the model needs to make it possible to calculate the risk. So I think I mean, at the beginning, the people that we were getting involved was like, what do you need that for? And I think it was it was a challenge to get them involved, but at the end it was a good interaction to help us with this. And the other challenge that I mean, at the beginning, at the end it was not really a challenge, but at the beginning I thought it was going to be a challenge to explain the board how the number of the expected loss was achieved, uh, because obviously I obviously don't know the details of the model inside, but but when you tell them, I mean, we are taking into account the volume of transactions, the amount of the transactions, the revenue, the income, and all the other data that we collect. It helped them make sense of how the number was achieved. But it was a little bit challenging at the beginning explaining that, but I mean, I think it went through very good.
Fantastic. It's weird, no matter how many places I travel around the world, and Bob's been quite a few places that I know of because we've worked together for a number of years, that the one language, regardless of the country, that boards speak is money, right? And if you can talk money,
Yeah,
they'll completely understand you. Fantastic, Alejandro. Thank
that's,
you.
you're welcome.
Christian, you've been dealing or working with the professional services implementation of some risk driven programs for customers. What have you found that working with all your customers are the first steps at starting a data-driven risk reduction strategy?
The first, probably the first things that need to be taken into account once you're doing a data-driven risk reduction strategy is to have an open mind of how this is going to work, because it works in a very, very different way that other risk strategies work, because people tend to think of the asset and how I'm going to protect the asset and how I'm going to go to that deep level of detail. But when you're talking about data-driven risk reduction, you need to think of it in a more macro scale. Once that has been achieved, you need to have in the organization a level of comfort between a lot of parties, because we're going to need a lot of data from a lot of different areas of the company that are not necessarily IT. We're going to talk to you a little bit about human resources, because we need to talk about controls. We're going to need to do a lot of talking with business. And sometimes the data that we need from businesses, like Alejandro explained, is I don't want to give you that data. Why do you need that? Why do you need to know the number of PHI records or PII records? It's hard sometimes to actually explain to them that we need that data to actually achieve the result that we're looking for and be able to quantify risk in an appropriate manner. So getting to know the organization very, very well, this would be the second step, and getting to have that synergy within the organization.
Okay. I mean, obviously, both Alejandro and you are looking at this same breadth of organizational-wide requirements, but each of you has a different path in that, right? From an internal standpoint, Alejandro's needs to build alliances and bridges in order to get that information. Do you find as a consultant that it's easier to build those bridges because you're coming from the outside, or do you find it more difficult in getting people to share the appropriate information from you or with you?
It all depends on the level of trust the person inside of the organization has. If it has a high level of trust, getting the SME into the conversation helps out significantly to just get that little edge across. However, if the person inside the organization is not that they don't trust him, but it's that there is, in certain organizations, there's like siloed information, and that siloed information is very, very strict. Even with this SME there, is gonna be a lot of work. Sometimes it needs to happen through escalation to actually be able to get that information flowing.
So that points me in a different direction for my next question. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at it from a project standpoint, whether it's internal or through a consultant such as yourself, having the appropriate champion of that project is critical to the success. In your opinion, I mean, at what level should a data-driven cyber risk reduction program be championed at? Is it the CISO or is it above the CISO?
The CISO is a good place to start. And if he has the level of leverage like Alejandro had to be able to get the data, it's a good place to start. However, the higher you go, the better it is, because you're going to be able to get that leverage to get the data from all the different areas. To give an example, we were doing one analysis for a multi-industry company, and having that access to the person just below the CEO, and with her being able to talk to the CEO and just push things, it helped out a lot, because everybody was just helping out. Everybody was just working together to get the data. That's probably one of the most complex assessments we have done, since it involved a multi-industry engagement, where we had to talk about, I think it was about 38 different companies that we were working with, understanding each one of them, understanding what their needs were, how many records they had, how many transactions they were doing, and each one had a set of controls by their own that they were implementing that had to be considered into it. So by itself, it's hard to think about the controls themselves and how they're implemented and how efficient they are. Multiply that by 38 and try to come up with a single number on how efficient the control is company-wide. It just, it was a little nightmare, I can tell you that. But at the end, we came through.
Obviously, that was one of the more difficult areas, but or difficult projects. But what are some of the most difficult areas to measure within organizations that you've worked with so far?
Probably one of the most difficult things to measure, because companies, unless it's their bread and butter, they don't consider it, is their intellectual property, if they have any. And most companies do have it, and they don't consider it intellectual property, but if they have an online banking that made themselves, or they have any software that made themselves, it is at the end of the day intellectual properties. But they haven't really measured how much that will cost them, how much that will cost them if that software goes loose and goes into the wild. Maybe they haven't even thought about it. So that's one of the harder questions to answer. Apart from that, most companies don't take into account and don't quantify the amount of records they have. So trying to probe that and understand how many they have is always a challenge. They think they have so many, and as we start probing,
No, keep going.
Go ahead.
So how did you overcome those challenges?
So to overcome those challenges, the interview process is key, because you need an SME that knows very, very well how to quantify how to gather the data and understand the questions. And this goes for every single thing that we do, from profiling the business to determining the impacts to doing the control measurement. And to give you an example, one of the basic questions that we ask is, do you have a vulnerability management program? Most people will say yes. But as we start to probe them and understand what do they mean by having a vulnerability management program, we find a lot of fallacies that a vulnerability program should have. So just by answering the question, yes, we do have one, doesn't mean that it's a completely efficient control. So that probing that is done by the analyst and his ability to actually go deeper into what the client is saying and answering to the questions is key to overcome those issues.
Okay. Fantastic. In the last question I have for you, Christian, on this, and then we'll get to a ground robin question that I have. What have you found as the best trusted sources within an organization to gain the information that you need to start the program internally? Is there a specific group that you tend to rely on as the source of truth, or do you find that it varies?
It varies. It depends on what part of the assessment we're working on. If we're working on profiling the business, definitely the business people. We need to talk to the business. If we're talking about controls, IT or security, depending on how it's made. Impact, it varies.
Okay. Fantastic. So I got my next question is I'm going to kind of do a round robin here. And I'll start with the same order that we were in. It's mainly an opinion piece, and some of it's going to be data driven, right? So Bob, what are the first areas that should be measured to decrease financial exposure to cyber risk? I think you're on mute. Bob, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. That's good.
I'll just go ahead and repeat that. I think you and Christian were alluding to this in your discussion just a moment ago. It's the exposure profile. We've been doing this for a long time, and we know that a lot of companies want to go straight to how well controls are implemented, or they want to get into the operational metrics. But the true reality is it's the exposure profile that needs to be understood first. And that is an understanding of how many records you have and what are the types of records that you have across your business. Obviously, if you have a data privacy officer, that's their main function inside the organization, is to know that answer. In addition to that, what is the value of the intellectual property that you have? If you're doing financial transactions, how much money is moving through electronic mechanisms on a daily basis that could be prone to fraud? What is the revenue that you generate? What are your operating hours? If you had a business interruption event, what could that look like for your particular business? So it's that exposure profile that you have to start with. In fact, we've done some super preliminary assessments for corporate directors just by doing a very, very simple profile exercise with some assumptions around controls. And even after we move into the deeper assessment, those assumptions around the controls in the very beginning aren't that dramatically different once we start to take in the audit from IBM or KPMG or whoever the consulting firm happens to be. But if you don't get that exposure profile right from the beginning, you're going to misdirect those finite resources that you have inside the business.
Okay. So would you consider that a quick win or the largest reduction, or both?
It's both. I mean, without understanding that, you can't get to the quick win, right? That's the reality. One profile is understood, and using something like X Analytics, then you can get very quickly to where do I need to focus on my business? Where do I need to implement, zero trust or multi-factor authentication or better security awareness training? But at least you know that once you get that exposure profile understood.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, Bob. Alejandro, do you agree, disagree? What's been your experience?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I mostly agree on the profiling. What I think is as part of the profiling, you have to prioritize in the areas where you have your more important assets. For example, we use like many companies the term the crown jewels, and those crown jewels are based basically on two things: the data they store, like the classification of the data and the amount of data, if it's a confidential or PII data or restricted data, and also the impact they represent for the company, like if they are the main processor for the financial transactions in our case, and that kind of stuff. So once you know your attack surface and you have you can have the overall visibility to have that profile that Bob was mentioning, and you have do that profile based on what are your crown jewels, what are the assets that are gonna impact your financial statement at the end of the year if they fail or if they are compromised by an attack. And also you can have as part of the profile, if you have like a good vulnerability program like it was mentioned before, then you can also focus on where you have the greater risk. For example, the assets where you have critical vulnerabilities, that you can also focus on that, because that's gonna be like maybe the weakest point on your surface attack. And once you have defined that, then you know where to put additional controls, or where to do the corrections or improvements to decrease that risk.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Christian, I'm going to twist it just a little bit different here. I mean, obviously, Bob talked about understanding the landscape, understanding property, and doing that. In your experience, what are the steps that an organization can take to get a better understanding of what that landscape looks like if they were just starting fresh?
Okay. So in order to get a better understanding of that landscape, if they were starting fresh, I would say they would need to understand what threats they are actually facing. Understand what they are facing is key to be able to get that exposure profile. And there are plenty of reports out there that can get you started. For example, one of them is Verizon DBIR. And according to their statistics, it's about 90% of attacks fall into one of 9 categories. So just by knowing that, you would know that those are the type of attacks you should be very, very focused on as threats to your organization. However, the actual report goes a little bit deeper into saying in your industry, there's going to be 3 major attacks or threats that you should focus on, because that's what, with all the data they compile on breaches and incidents, that's what they have figured out. So using reports like that is a good place to start building your own threat landscape, and then start building your exposure profile using all the other information that is required, like amount of transactions that you do, how much of those transactions are actually, how big the transactions are, the amount of records that you have, how much your intellectual property costs.
Right. Right. So one of the challenges that I've seen organizations have, and tell me that if you've seen the same thing, is we've talked about vulnerability scanning, we've talked about exposure, we've talked about threat landscape, is organizations don't know what that exposure looks like in terms of what assets are actually exposed to the threats that are out there. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways that organizations can build programs to basically map what that to them, and how can that be pushed into the analytics portion of what we're talking about here?
Mapping that requires knowing your infrastructure at the end of the day. So tools help out with that. So using vulnerability scanners to map out what exposures you have, in how many assets you have, a good inventory to determine, to know exactly what you're exposed to. So what is exposed is key. Most organizations that I've seen don't have a decent inventory to start with. So to begin having the inventory of your assets, and then taking a step further and classifying those assets in your inventory to determine how risky they are, can be used to be placed in the exposure profile.
Right. And we've been talking about asset classification for as long as I can remember. Some people do it really well. Some people have a challenge in that, and sometimes that's political in nature. Sometimes that's just size, right? You mentioned the company that you were working with that had 38 subsidiaries. That's a large infrastructure to manage. Things are being managed in different ways. So, I mean, obviously, when we talk about the basic building blocks of information security, knowing what you have and what you need to protect is critical. And I'm sure it's critical in actually getting down into that cyber risk reduction discussion. So thank you. All right. I am going to do a round robin here quick before we get to some of the questions. Bob, any follow-ups or thoughts on maybe anything that we possibly missed during this discussion? I know it's been a good discussion. Any thoughts from you?
I want to go back to something that Christian just mentioned. I think the Verizon DBIR report is a great source. It's a great reference that people should look at on an annual basis. They have an interactive tool on their website that's actually pretty fascinating as well. But, I do want to stress, because we see this a lot, the volume of incident is not identical to the severity of incident. And what I mean by that is the things that occur most often generally incur the least amount of damages to companies. Just put ransomware on the side, though ransomware is coming down a lot over the last 9 months or so. But, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because misuse and human error are reported extremely low in the DBIR data set from Verizon. But when there are error events or misuse events inside of organizations, they can be highly impactful from a monetary standpoint. One of the best examples of that is Facebook. Facebook a couple years ago was misusing data. Some of that data was related to minors, so basically folks that were under the age of 18. They received a $5 billion fine. That is $5 billion from the Federal Trade Commission. So, I just want to be very cautious about putting too much emphasis on the volume of incident as compared to the severity of incident. The two are not identical with each other.
Thank you. Alejandro, any additional comments? You're on mute, Alejandro.
I'm sorry. One of the things that you have to do as part of this exercise is that you have to know the threats to your business. I mean, it's not the same threat for a healthcare business that for a financial business. Even though, for example, we have in the corporation the insurance and financial services, and the type of attacks or frauds that can occur are not the same, even though both of them are financial industry. So you have to know the kind of threats and the type of attacks you can experience, so you can give more context to the solutions that you're gonna and the solutions and the controls you need to decrease the risk.
Right. And Christian, anything, last words from you?
I think as last words is take an open mind into looking at quantifying your risk. It's going to be an eye-opener once you start doing it. It's going to change the way you see things, because you're going to be able to start doing really return on investments on your security solutions and be able to report that to the board or C-level execs.
Right, and it's also going to drive that budgetary discussion in a manner to where you can actually present quantifiable data to back up the need for those new services or tools that the company requires. Fantastic.
Oh, definitely. And
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that reminds me of a case talking about budgetary discussions, that there was a case that if you're going to do quantifying your risk, make sure you know how you're going to reduce that risk before you enter the budget meeting, because the last thing you want to do is have a board member say, so what happens if I give you X amount and you don't know what to do? It's going to be a very difficult discussion. So if you are going to quantify your risk and definitely know how much you're going to be the return on investments, if that question ever arises.
Fantastic. So appreciate that, Christian. We do have some questions in the question board. If anybody's got any additional questions, use the chat function inside of the meeting to ask your questions. So I'm going to quickly, I'm going to start looking at these. First question is for Alejandro. Alejandro, one of our guests is asking what tool you use to manage your cyber risk. Would
we,
you
we
mind sharing?
yes, we are using since I stated before, we started like about 6 months ago using X Analytics. But it's not just the tool, it's also the support of CISAP with their expert consultants that help us um, input the information on the tool and give us the context that we need to get, I mean, the info we need to get from the business and help us analyze the results. So that's what we use in X Analytics plus the support of CISAP.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alejandro. I'm
You're
going to
welcome.
open this one up to both Christian and Bob, whoever wants to jump in on it. The question is, in the companies that you work with, have you had any attack that incurs losses or has been presented? And have you presented how they were minimized with your risk reduction strategies? Bob, you're on mute.
Oh. Thanks, Jensen. Derek, I think, I think on that, the answer is yes, right? Obviously. We see it twofold. We see where there's claims being filed to their carrier because they do have cyber insurance, and then we see that there's actual losses that they just keep private within their business. In both of those cases, they have been able to see what the outcomes would have been using something like X Analytics. And that gave them confidence when they saw the actual losses and how close they were to what X Analytics told them those losses would be. So that's a win for us, right? That's a win for our customers. But in addition to that, they also have used that same information then to reprioritize their control or technology implementation in their business. And sometimes they've even used it to modify their insurance position as well. So, they might have increased limit or ensured that they had coverage for things that they didn't have coverage previously for. Christian, I'll pass it to you.
And
Christian?
one engagement that we did.
Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, in one engagement that we did, we were working on. They had a ransomware attack a couple of months ago, and using risk quantification, we were able to show them how their ransomware impact would have been reduced by using the controls. So the answer is definitely yes. Alongside that one, another institution got hit by a very big business email compromise attack. And this was more showing how the controls would have prevented it more than reduced the risk. But preventing two-factor authentication, they would have completely reduced the risk by substantial amounts.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, that shows the power of the analytics at work, right? Even sometimes in the negative or after the fact. I mean, obviously, knowing the information is critical beforehand, but you can always utilize it to build better after an exposure. All right, two last questions that I have so far here. The comment is, this type of evaluation is very similar to a business impact analysis in a business continuity plan. Bob, with that statement, I mean, I know that there's a difference, but could you elaborate on what that difference is?
Well, I think there's overlap, right? I mean, I think that's a factual statement, right? There is overlap, and there should be overlap between the two. I think the main difference is that with a normal business impact analysis, it's a lot of opinion inside the organization about what things would be if bad things were to take place in the future. The difference on the cyber side is that we have a particular method, model, apparatus that processes this information through a series of over 100,000 calculations to ensure that they really do understand what it means in a financial perspective. It's not just an estimate that somebody's guessing at on a whiteboard. It's actually a mathematical exercise. But beyond that, I think the collection and what they're looking at, I think they're very similar.
Okay. And then, so that begs the last question that I have here on the board. It's ISO 27001 can support us in its financial exposure for cyber risk. So I'm going to paraphrase that a little bit. Can compliance, I mean, obviously we've talked about controls, but can compliance drive some of the inputs in this quantified state?
Can definitely
So-
help, but I wouldn't say
Okay.
compliance with ISO 27001 would go straight to help out with reducing risk. Especially ISO 27001 that is more based on following the procedures, following the processes, and making sure everything is documented, doesn't really focus itself on risk. If we were talking about more compliance with NIST or CIS, I would say the impact would be much higher than with ISO 27001. I think Alejandro wanted to also jump in on this one. Or Bob, I'm not sure who.
Bob, you had thoughts?
Yeah, Christian, I can add to that. I mean, look, I think any one of the frameworks out there is a good place to start. Obviously, Appendix A of ISO 27001, the controls that are listed there, I mean, of course, they can be helpful, right? And they can help reduce risk. To Christian's point, obviously, the NIST CSF framework goes beyond some of the elements of 27001. CIS, critical security controls, I think are a little bit easier for most folks to understand. So they also go beyond what you see in 27001. But I think the reality is no matter what the framework is, they all have pluses and minuses. And there is no framework that's going to get you to a perfect security state. I would suggest looking at a harmony between both frameworks and technology implementations. And that's really what's going to give you that benefit on your investment inside your business.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any additional questions here, so we're going to wrap it up for the day. I want to thank our panelists, Bob Vesio, Alejandro Gonzalez, and Christian Nane. I appreciate you guys joining. It's obvious that there is a lot of work ahead of us in the industry for quantifying data or cyber risk. I think we've made some great strides and we've had some great discussion here today. I appreciate you all. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.
You're welcome.